They called him a vagrant before he even spoke, laughed as if his presence was a mistake. One guard said the soup kitchen was down the street. A banker smirked and asked if he was here to fix the plumbing. No one cared why he came, they cared what he looked like. Black skin, worn coat, calm posture. That was all they needed to decide he was nothing. They didn't check his ID. They didn't read his paperwork. They didn't bother with facts. They just wanted him out. What they didn't know was this wasn't just a man they humiliated. It was the moment everything around them began to fall. This is the story of how arrogance turns into ruin, one judgment at a time. If that pulled you in, like the video, subscribe for what's coming, and drop a comment. Where are you watching from? And how do you think this ends? Atwill Monroe walked into the towering atrium of Lening Federal Bank just before the morning rush peaked. His coat, faded at the collar, hung heavy with rain from the walk between the lot and the glass double doors. His shoes were clean but worn, the soles flattened from years of use, the shine dulled by weather. Still, he moved with calm purpose, straight-backed, eyes forward, a thick envelope tucked beneath his arm. His steps echoed lightly on the marble, muffled only by the low murmur of soft jazz filtering from the ceiling. At the front desk, a woman in a crisp navy uniform glanced up as he approached. Her lips had been curled in a serviceable smile as she welcomed a man in a tailored camel coat just moments before. But as her eyes found Atwill, her expression shifted. The smile fell away. Her eyes dropped quickly to the frayed cuff of his sleeve, then slid over the rest of him with a glance that flickered somewhere between pity and disdain. She turned her head slightly, speaking into her earpiece. The man in the camel coat was guided toward the executive elevators by another associate. Atwill stood patiently in front of the counter. The receptionist didn't look back at him. Her fingers tapped idly at the keyboard, eyes on the screen. He cleared his throat gently. She didn't flinch. Instead, without raising her gaze, she said in a tone meant for dismissing inquiries, "Appointments are back hallway. First door on the left." She didn't ask his name, didn't request confirmation. He gave a small nod, adjusted the envelope beneath his arm, and turned to follow her vague direction. The hallway wasn't marked. The carpet here changed from polished marble to dull gray, the lighting softer, more yellowed. It led to a cramped waiting alcove beside a closed janitorial closet. There were 3 worn leather chairs beneath a plaque honoring the bank's founder. An oil painting of a man in a bow tie and waistcoat, holding a cane, smiling faintly over a table of silver coins. Atwill sat. The leather creaked under him. The receptionist's tone still echoed in his mind. He opened the envelope, checked the documents inside again. Authorization contracts, power of transfer forms, all notarized. His name was inked in bold across the top page, and the amount listed beneath it started with a 9 and ended with 6 trailing zeros. He took a breath, waited. 10 minutes passed. The door at the end of the hall remained closed. Footsteps sounded behind him. A shadow stretched over his lap. He looked up. The man looming over him wore a black blazer with gold trim and a holstered radio. His name tag read Glenn. "Sir, you can't loiter here," he said flatly, voice carrying the texture of long habit. Atwill blinked. "I have a meeting with Mr. Rusk at 10. Glenn's eyes swept over Atwill's coat again, then down to the envelope. "With who?" "Rusk," Atwill repeated calmly. "Executive Finance. Scheduled this past Tuesday." Glenn tilted his head. "Don't recall anyone mentioning that." "You sure you got the right building?" Atwill pulled out the printed confirmation. Glenn didn't look at it. He gestured toward the lobby. "Maybe step outside. There's a bench on Main. Wait out there, yeah? This area's for clients." Atwill's brow furrowed. "I am a client." The guard's posture stiffened slightly. "Don't get smart. You'll make people uncomfortable." Atwill didn't move. Glenn stepped closer. "Look, I don't know what you think this is, but we're not handing out food today." He lowered his voice, a conspiratorial smirk twitching at the corner of his mouth. "This ain't the mission, brother. You're gonna need to take it somewhere else before someone calls Real Security." A woman in a pencil skirt and pearls walked past just then, casting a glance toward the alcove. Glenn looked at her, then back at Atwill. His tone sharpened. "You're done. Move along." Atwill stood, slowly, folding the envelope back under his coat. No words. No protest. He stepped past Glenn, back into the hallway, retracing his steps beneath the half-lit wall sconces. The receptionist didn't look up as he passed. The rain had started again outside. He would have to create his own path through the side door and silence. He entered through the staff corridor at the rear of the building, where the walls were concrete, the lighting industrial, and the only sound was the hum of unseen machinery behind metal panels. A young clerk in khakis and a lanyard noticed him and paused. Atwill raised the envelope calmly and said he was here for a rescheduled appointment with Mr. Rusk in executive accounts. The clerk's response was neutral, cautious. He asked Atwill to wait while he called upstairs. The call was brief. Permission was granted, barely. The clerk returned and motioned Atwill down the narrow hall toward the elevators that service staff used. Upstairs, on the executive level, the decor changed instantly. Lacquered walls, glass dividers, recessed lighting, and artwork that screamed money without ever saying it. Atwill stepped out into the plush carpeted corridor, met by a receptionist stationed behind a frosted desk framed by high arching windows. Her blazer was spotless, her posture alert, but her expression shifted the moment she saw Atwill. She blinked slowly, scanning him from head to toe. Her lips parted in a partial smile that never reached her eyes. "Sir, may I help you?" she asked, her voice lilting with a tone of polite interrogation. Atwill introduced himself again, stating calmly that he was here to see Mr. Rusk. He handed her the printed appointment sheet, already worn at the edges from being pulled out so many times that morning. She accepted it with 2 fingers, held it up to the light as if it might reveal some hidden stain, then glanced toward her monitor. She squinted at the screen, then gave a slight laugh and tilted her head. "Are you certain you're in the right building?" she asked. Her voice was syrupy now, her words slow and deliberate, the kind used for confused tourists or elderly patients. "This is Lenning Federal, not the pawn shop across the street." Atwill didn't respond to the insult. Instead, he waited. She seemed disappointed by his lack of reaction. After another long pause, she tapped a few keys and called someone, whoever had confirmed the rescheduling earlier. "Yes, I have a Mr. Monroe here," she said, hesitating before saying his name, eyes still on his coat, which had dried in uneven patches. "Yes, I said, ma'am, I'm fine." She hung up. "Mr. Rusk is in a meeting," she said. "He'll be ready for you shortly. Please wait down the hall." She gestured, not to the velvet sofas behind her or the private client waiting lounge that overlooked the courtyard, but toward a narrow corridor ending in a half-open copy room. Atwill didn't argue. He walked quietly past her, felt the weight of her gaze between his shoulders until he turned the corner. The waiting space had no chairs, just a ledge where courier boxes were stacked and a cracked tile where the baseboard had pulled away from the drywall. The air smelled faintly of toner. He stood there, envelope in hand, while around the corner he heard heels clicking, muffled laughter, and the polite murmur of someone offering espresso to the man who had just entered the main reception. That man, a white man in a tailored green suit and leather briefcase, had walked in 5 minutes after Atwill. Yet within 2 minutes of arrival, he had been escorted warmly through the glass doors into a private conference room by a junior associate. Atwill caught a glimpse of it through the reflection in a side window. The way they nodded, smiled, and even bowed slightly as they ushered the client toward refreshments. No one asked if he was in the right building. No one mentioned pawn shops. Time passed slowly. Atwill stood straight, his back against the cold wall, unmoving, as employees passed by him with glances that ranged from curious to dismissive. One woman, pushing a mail cart, accidentally bumped his foot and muttered something that wasn't an apology. A man in shirt sleeves glanced at him, then quickly looked away, muttering under his breath about deliveries going through the freight entrance. Someone left a half-eaten granola bar wrapper on the copier beside him and didn't return to pick it up. The silence around Atwill wasn't passive. It was cultivated, like a well-practiced performance. Every glance, smirk, delay, and misdirection had been rehearsed in some other form, on some other face. He had seen it before, in boardrooms, in airport lounges, even at charity galas he sponsored. But here, in a place that owed him nothing but profit, it burned deeper. Because he wasn't asking for privilege. He was asking to be respected as someone who had earned a place in this building not by lineage or favor, but by results, contracts, and value. The paper the receptionist had handed him was still folded in his palm, a worthless brochure that said nothing about what he was owed. He looked at the reflection of himself in the marble facade of the building. The coat was wrinkled near the shoulders. The shoes were scuffed. His tie was still neat, his expression unreadable. He had choices. He could walk away, write a furious letter, move his capital to another institution. But something inside him had settled into stillness, a stillness that carried more gravity than rage. He stood, walked around the corner, and re-entered the bank, this time through the secondary client entrance reserved for commercial clients, knowing this path would bypass the front desk entirely. He passed security without resistance. There were no metal detectors, no questions, only glances from the guards that scanned his figure like they were still trying to categorize what kind of threat he might be. Upstairs, the floor buzzed with the subdued energy of late morning activity. Keyboards clicked, phones buzzed gently, and the occasional laugh echoed from behind glass-walled offices. Atwill stepped toward the main desk where a cluster of junior staff reviewed forms, coffee in hand, eyes darting from screen to screen. He waited, standing quietly, until one of them noticed him. A young man with a peach fuzz mustache and rolled-up sleeves nudged the woman beside him. "Think that guy's here to mop the floor," he whispered, not realizing Atwill could hear every word. She stifled a laugh, glanced at Atwill's shoes, and shrugged. "He looks like someone pulled him out from under the freeway." Atwill kept his face still, his eyes ahead. The male clerk eventually approached, clearing his throat, his expression a mix of smirk and forced politeness. "Need help with something?" he asked, drawing out the word, help like it might taste wrong. Atwill replied firmly, "I'm following up on a scheduled transaction involving corporate account management. I was told Mr. Rusk was unavailable, but I'd like to speak with someone from the department." The young man blinked as if recalibrating. Sure. 1 second." He returned to the others, muttering, "He talks like he owns half the building." The other clerk laughed again and returned to her screen, but within moments another figure appeared, an older woman in a dark blazer, stiff posture, the laminated nameplate on her lapel, reading Marlene Draper, Division Supervisor. Marlene didn't smile as she approached. Her heels clicked with clipped efficiency as she sized up Atwill with a single sweeping glance. "Mr. Monroe, is it? I was told there was an inquiry regarding a pending file." "I can assist," she said. Her voice was sharp, her tone civil but taut. Atwill nodded, handing over the envelope. She accepted it, but didn't open it immediately. Instead, she turned toward her desk and motioned him to follow. Her cubicle was more ornate than the others, real wood trim, a small potted plant, framed certificates from the State Banking Commission. She sat and gestured toward a narrow guest chair that had lost some of its cushion. Atwill sat without comment. Marlene finally opened the envelope, her fingers moving with studied precision. She began scanning the documents, flipping through them as if looking for flaws, her eyes narrowing at the printed bank routing information and contract line items. She stopped at the notarized authorization and looked up. "This signature," she said, pointing with the tip of a manicured finger. "Can you confirm this is yours?" Atwill didn't flinch. "Yes." She nodded slowly, but the suspicion didn't leave her expression. "You understand that corporate accounts of this size require additional clearance. Your documentation appears in order, but I'll need to authenticate each page with operations before any action is taken." Atwill leaned slightly forward. "I have clearance. Your office verified it last week. This is the same file approved by compliance on Wednesday." Marlene gave a tight smile, one that said she wasn't listening. "Our protocols shift daily depending on internal assessments. It's not personal." As she turned to scan the first form into her terminal, the screen flickered with the bank's internal dashboard. Atwill caught a glimpse of the account name on the interface, Monroe Holdings LLC Tier 1 Access. The figure beneath it was staggering, 8 digits, beginning with a 9. He watched as Marlene typed in a hold code. A red warning flashed. Clearance override required. She didn't react. The receptionist this time was a younger man, clean-shaven and overly energetic. His tone brisk, but not rude, as he asked Atwill for the name of the executive he intended to meet. Atwill replied evenly, "Mr. Rusk, Executive Finance." The young man clicked away at the keyboard, frowning after a moment. "There's no record of that appointment on the system," he said, glancing up. Atwill placed the printed confirmation on the desk, dated and time-stamped, with Mr. Rusk's digital signature clearly visible. The receptionist stared at it, then back at his screen. "Strange," he muttered, then offered a nervous shrug. "Maybe wrote down the wrong date." Atwill's gaze didn't falter. "This was confirmed yesterday. I received an email at 3:16 p.m. The receptionist, sensing he had poked something too firm to bend, mumbled that he would get the branch manager. 5 minutes later, a woman in a fitted red blazer and a Lenning Federal badge reading Mirrokeen Branch Executive appeared. She extended her hand stiffly and introduced herself with practiced confidence. "Mr. Monroe, I understand there's been some confusion with your appointment. Unfortunately, our internal scheduling platform updated last night and may have purged non-priority entries." Her voice was clipped, smooth, and utterly detached. "Let me guess," Atwill said. "My entry wasn't marked as priority." She gave a shallow smile and replied, "It's possible the designation didn't meet the threshold due to account activity status or incomplete verification." He raised an eyebrow. "The account in question was opened with full federal credentials, confirmed by your compliance office last quarter." Mira tilted her head slightly, the way someone does when they're trying to appear patient while ignoring your words. "Well, since your appointment has unfortunately lapsed, we'll need to verify your identity again before proceeding with any sensitive discussion. Standard procedure." Atwill's jaw tensed, but he didn't argue. He opened the folder and removed a full set of identification: passport, driver's license, notarized IRS correspondence. He laid them on the counter with quiet precision. Mira glanced at the documents, then paused over the license. Her fingers hesitated. "This address," she said, tapping the ID card with a manicured nail. "It's quite a high-value residential zone. You reside here alone?" The question was phrased as if seeking verification, but the tone suggested suspicion. "That's correct," Atwill replied. Myra's brows pinched slightly. "It's just rare to see this type of residence associated with a personal account. Are you sure this ID hasn't been misprinted or reassigned?" Atwill's voice was low. "It hasn't." Mira turned to a nearby associate and whispered something. The woman walked briskly away. Mira returned her attention to Atwill. "We'll have to scan and validate these through our updated KYC system. While we do that, we'll need you to complete a revised client profile form." She handed him a clipboard with an 8-page document clipped to it, requiring everything from social affiliations to personal income breakdowns, most of which had already been submitted in prior filings. Atwill sat in a corner cubicle, out of view from the executive lounge, filling in questions that felt less like banking protocol and more like a low-key interrogation. As he wrote, he could hear hushed conversations around him, staff murmuring about audit flags and priority codes, using acronyms that masked their assumptions in administrative camouflage. He heard one say, "I don't think he fits Tier 1 status," followed by another voice replying, "Well, he says he does. But that address doesn't line up with our retention matrix." 30 minutes later, Mira returned, now accompanied by the same male clerk from the previous day. Her tone was apologetic, but only just. "Unfortunately, the system has red flagged some inconsistencies between the ID and residential metadata. We'll need to consult our fraud department for further steps. In the meantime, your access has been temporarily restricted until the discrepancies are resolved." Atwill said nothing for several seconds. Then, deliberately, he asked, "What inconsistencies specifically?" Myra's expression hardened. "Well, the combination of name, address, and account tier appears to fall outside of established trends. The data suggests a possible error in profile classification, and we have an obligation to investigate before allowing access to sensitive financial structures." He stood. "So to clarify," he said, "despite verified documentation, previous approvals, notarized filings, and my physical presence, your system now claims that I may not be who I say I am?" Mira gave a short nod. "That's one way to interpret it. We prefer to say we're just being thorough." They stepped around him on the walkway, eyes averted, heads down, their behavior not out of malice, but out of something more insidious, habit. At 9 on the dot, the glass doors unlocked, and Atwill stepped inside with the same quiet dignity that had carried him through 3 days of escalating disrespect. Today he had brought additional paperwork, including a letter from his legal team, notarized and formatted to the bank's exact specifications. He intended to deliver it directly to someone authorized to take action. The receptionist, a new face, young, fresh out of college by the look of her, blinked at him, and when he introduced himself, she scrolled quickly through the system. "There's nothing scheduled under that name," she said with an apologetic shrug. He handed over the letter. "It's not a meeting," he replied. "It's an official filing. I just need a handoff receipt." She hesitated, clearly unsure, then pointed him toward the client documentation desk in the rear of the lobby. Atwill approached the desk, where 2 assistants were chatting over coffee. One of them, a tall man with a tight haircut and visible tattoos crawling down his wrist, took the letter from Atwill with one hand while the other remained cupped around a cappuccino. As Atwill reached for the clipboard to sign the drop-off form, the man's gaze dropped to Atwill's hands, aged, calloused, the skin dark and coarse from years of labor and resilience, not luxury. "Man, with hands like that," the assistant said, chuckling, "you sure you're not here to fix the pipes in the basement?" His tone was light, joking, but the smile that followed was jagged and too loud, designed for the coworker beside him who snorted into his coffee. Atwill didn't answer. He took the pen, signed the form, and looked the man in the eye before placing the clipboard back on the desk with careful control. The assistant tapped the paper twice, clearly amused with himself, then walked away without another word, muttering something about surprise inspections under his breath. Atwill turned, heading for the elevator, intending to deliver a copy of the transfer form directly to Mira Keene. But as he passed the marble security station between the lobby and the executive level, a new security guard, taller than Glenn, younger, and far less restrained, stepped forward and blocked his path. "Sir, I need to see your clearance to access that floor." Atwill explained calmly that he was not going to the executive offices, but only to the second-floor records desk to submit documentation as per procedure. The guard shook his head. "Not without clearance." Atwill motioned toward the client processing desk. "I was just directed there." The guard folded his arms. "I've been told to keep an eye out for suspicious individuals. You've been in and out of this building too many times this week with no confirmed meetings and lots of paperwork. If you don't have an appointment, you need to leave." Atwill's voice stayed measured. "I'm here to submit verified documents, not loiter." The guard took a step closer. "That's not how it looks. You're making the staff nervous. Let's go." Atwill straightened. "You're ejecting me for turning in legally required banking documents." The guard gave a tight smile. "I'm removing you because you don't belong here. It's private property, and we reserve the right." Atwill stood his ground, his posture unwavering. "This is a public-facing financial institution, and I have business here." That was when the second guard arrived. No discussion, no request for clarification, just a firm grip on Atwill's elbow, followed by a sharp directive. "Out. Now." They escorted him through the lobby with swift professionalism, not yelling, not shoving, just guiding with force calibrated to be humiliating, but not prosecutable. Employees looked up from behind counters and terminals. Not one spoke. Not one moved. Not one protested. Even those who had seen his face all week, who had served him coffee, who had watched him enter and exit quietly, said nothing. The receptionist watched him pass with a blank expression, her fingers frozen over her keyboard. One banker in the corner adjusted his cufflinks and looked away, pretending to focus on the Bloomberg feed scrolling across his monitor. Atwill was walked through the double glass doors and left standing just outside on the steps, the revolving door swinging shut behind him with an audible click that echoed more final than any voice. He looked down at the folder, still in his hand. It hadn't left his grasp through the entire encounter. His coat was immaculate. His shoes were shined. His posture, as always, was impeccable. But he had just been dragged from a building that held $87 million of his company's assets, without a word of legal justification. The irony burned slowly, like coals. He had once funded this bank's small business expansion portfolio. He had spoken on their behalf at a Chamber of Commerce gala. He had arranged scholarships for their summer interns. And now he had been physically removed like a threat, like an intruder. Yet the silence he left behind in the lobby felt like a storm system collapsing on itself, a vacuum where dignity had once stood, and now contempt hung thick in the air. Inside, just beyond the security gates and past the client lounge, a group of mid-level staff gathered near the second-floor break room, clustered around a coffee machine as they prepared for another mindless block of spreadsheet work and empty meetings. One of them, a young man in a navy vest and horn-rimmed glasses, tilted his head back and imitated Atwell's deep voice, dragging the vowels in mock formality while holding his coffee cup like a leather folder. Another, a woman with a high ponytail and a laugh like broken glass, added that he looked like one of those sad old guys from a budget comedy who always gets mistaken for the janitor. A third employee joined in, miming Atwell's slow walk and mumbling, "Excuse me, sir, I believe I own this place," followed by exaggerated peals of laughter. They had seen the guards walk him out. They had seen him stand in the rain, unmoving. And now, in their minds, he was not a man who had brought documents or spoken with composure. He was an image to be ridiculed, a caricature to entertain the boredom between team syncs and tax form batching. They laughed not because they were cruel by nature, but because the culture allowed it. The walls around them, lined with portraits of founders and donors, all white, all solemn, all untouchable, created an atmosphere where power was presumed, not earned. And because Atwell had entered that space without their definition of power, without flash, without title badges or a known surname, they had been conditioned to view him not as one of their own, but as someone who didn't belong. They did not know what he had brought. They did not care what he represented. They only knew that he left quietly. And to them, that was enough proof of inferiority. What they failed to realize was that the folder Atwell had submitted, processed then discarded without protocol, had included a 3-page authorization linked to an internal classification code known only to senior corporate auditors. That code, embedded within a footnote on the second document, was a master control key. It belonged to an entity labeled Harrison Advisory Group, Tier Alpha, Asset Branch 19. That group held financial sway over more than 24 institutions, including Lenning Federal. And Atwell Monroe, through a complex lattice of trusts and shell operations, had sole executive authority over that branch. The folder had not been uploaded. It had not even been scanned. A junior associate had placed it on a stack of unreviewed forms beside the fax machine before heading out for his cigarette break. By the time it made it to Mira Keene's desk that afternoon, its contents had already triggered a system alarm in the bank's offshore compliance portal, where 2 line items had attempted to process but were flagged as inactive due to unauthorized restrictions put in place, ironically, during the delay tactics used to discredit Atwell's credentials. That digital inconsistency triggered a cross-check, which rippled through the Treasury servers and escalated to a C-level review. No one on site knew this was happening. Not yet. Not while they laughed. In the lounge, the jokes continued, now evolving into theories about what Atwell's briefcase might have held. One employee suggested it was full of empty resumes. Another speculated he had tried to forge documents with a typewriter. Someone pulled up a meme and overlaid Atwell's imagined silhouette next to a photo of a Monopoly board and wrote the caption, "Do not pass go, do not collect respect." They passed the image around, chuckling, sending it in internal chats, unaware that every stroke of mockery was being documented by internal compliance crawlers scanning employee devices for policy violations, a system they had signed away in their hiring contracts and now completely forgot existed. Meanwhile, Atwill sat in a black sedan 2 blocks down, the engine humming low, his briefcase open on his lap, and his phone pressed to his ear. The man on the other end confirmed that the freeze was initiated. Transfers would be routed through 4 auxiliary banks and consolidated into an out-of-network custody vault within 48 hours. All recurring deposits from Harriston's subsidiaries had been rerouted, and the pending quarterly rollover, amounting to $2.1 billion, would never touch Lenning Federal's books again. Atwill nodded once, said thank you, and hung up. He didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He simply looked out the window at the stone building behind him, watched as a man in a blazer exited with a foam coffee cup, and wondered how long it would take them to feel the weight of what they'd done. As sunlight poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows, reflecting off crystal water pitchers and the brushed metal fixtures of the private conference center, Atwill stood at the head of a long obsidian table, his presence no longer hidden, no longer denied. Across from him sat journalists from the city's 5 largest financial publications, along with regional television media, streaming equipment already live, cameras recording, and microphones angled to catch every word. There was no press secretary, no podium, no flourish. Just Atwill in a charcoal suit, crisp shirt, polished shoes, and a single folder, nearly identical in design to the one that had been dismissed by Lenning Federal Bank's staff days earlier. He began not with a speech, but with a series of documents laid out across the table. Tax-exempt registration for the Harriston Community Reconstruction Fund, verification of its $2.1 billion capital reserve, and a notarized executive chart showing that he, Atwill Monroe, was the sole founder, trustee, and final signatory on all disbursements. Reporters exchanged glances as he calmly explained how the fund had been built over 17 years, seeded through real estate restoration projects, minority business grants, and strategic equity growth in underserved districts, all structured under a framework designed to reroute capital from institutions that disregarded the very people they claimed to serve. He spoke plainly, without rancor, and then he revealed that over the past 3 years, Harriston Fund had gradually spread its operating deposits through 8 major banks, Lenning Federal being the largest, holding approximately 42% of active liquidity. No one in the room interrupted. The silence had changed its tone. It was no longer rooted in dismissal, but in the dawning awareness of magnitude. Atwill reached into the folder and produced the final document, a certified instruction, signed at 6:17 a.m. that morning, ordering the total withdrawal of every cent from Lenning Federal Bank across all Harriston-linked accounts and subsidiaries, effective immediately. The numbers printed clearly at the top confirmed the move of over 9 figures in liquid assets. This, he said, voice unwavering, is not retaliation. This is realignment. I will not support systems that mock dignity, question legitimacy, or deny basic professionalism on the basis of appearance. A few cameras tilted. One journalist's pen stopped mid-stroke. Another looked down and saw that her phone had begun to buzz violently with alerts. One of the smaller business blogs had already published the headline, "Philanthropist pulls $2.1 billion over bank bias. Shares plummet." The implications were no longer hypothetical. Elsewhere in the city, inside the sleek offices of Lenning Federal's headquarters, the shock was immediate. Red alerts flickered across the Treasury command terminals. Treasury officers watched in disbelief as the withdrawal requests streamed in with account keys that bypassed routine hold flags. At first, they assumed it was a cyber attack, but the authorizations were legitimate. Everything bore the proper encryption, matched the internal signature logs, and traced back to real, registered entities, some of which were decades old and impeccably maintained. The CFO was pulled from a breakfast meeting and rushed into the executive floor. Within minutes, the CEO's assistant entered the boardroom mid-call, whispering into her boss's ear that they were down $32 million in liquidity, and it wasn't slowing. Atwill, still in the conference room at Viral Tower, remained composed. He fielded a few direct questions with clarity. Yes, I was the client they escorted out. No, I will not be filing a discrimination suit. I do not need a courtroom to confirm what the world already saw. He handed one journalist a printed copy of the transaction timeline, detailing every attempt he had made to submit valid documentation and every obstruction placed before him. His tone was firm but not theatrical. "This is about precedent," he said, "not revenge." Across social platforms, the footage spread like a crack of thunder. Analysts dissected the numbers, television anchors cut into live programming, and by the close of business that day, Lenning Federal stock had shed over 9% of its value. By the next morning, it had dropped another 15%. Their investor call was delayed, their hotline overwhelmed, and a minor internal leak confirmed that multiple board members were now calling for an emergency session. What no one inside Lenning Federal had yet fully processed was that this wasn't just a large client departure. It was a fundamental breach of faith with an entire financial ecosystem they had never bothered to understand. One by one, regional branches from Boston to San Diego triggered their internal risk escalation protocols. Treasury departments scrambled to reallocate capital buffers to offset the outgoing flows, but the amount was too great and the timing too precise. In just 6 hours, 34 branches reported cash shortfalls significant enough to halt loan issuance, freeze large transfers, and deny withdrawal requests over a specific threshold. Clients who had never heard the name Atwell Monroe began receiving vague apologies from branch managers who could not explain why their scheduled fund releases were suddenly under review. In the central office, located in a high-rise just blocks from the city's financial district, a crisis meeting was called before sunset. Executives filed into the conference room with tight jaws and restless hands. The CEO, Forrest Holden, a man known for his unshakable composure and press-ready smiles, entered behind his general counsel and compliance chief, neither of whom spoke as they took their seats. A screen lit up at the end of the table displaying the internal losses. $197 million in withdrawn capital. 31 commercial accounts canceled. 4 high-net-worth clients demanding immediate asset transfer. The general counsel read from a preliminary report. "We have confirmation that the withdrawal was initiated under verified access using Tier Alpha client privileges. The linked identities are legitimate. The loss is unrecoverable." Silence followed, thick and absolute. The CFO's voice cracked as he asked how one man could have done this. The answer came not from the compliance chief, nor from a CIO, but from a mid-level audit analyst brought into the meeting by phone. "It's not just one man. It's what he represents. He holds the keystone account on a fund embedded into our ecosystem like an artery. We never questioned the structure because the capital was consistent. He never leveraged his influence until today." Forrest leaned forward, his palms pressed together. Then why did it happen now? The answer was simple. Because they had treated him like he didn't matter. Outside that room, panic began to manifest in digital form. Lenning stock was being sold off at a rate faster than the algorithmic stopgaps could throttle. Investors were demanding disclosures. Partners were pulling out of pending agreements. Internally, the HR department received 24 anonymous complaints referencing discriminatory culture, citing Atwell Monroe's case as proof of systemic bias. The legal team attempted damage control, drafting a bland press release about technical discrepancies and client misunderstandings, but by the time it went live, it was already too late. That evening, Bloomberg published a feature story headlined, "The Billionaire You Laughed Out the Door: How Lenning Federal Lost $2.1 billion in a Day." The article detailed everything: the ignored credentials, the mocking comments, the security escort. It quoted internal memos leaked by a whistleblower. It named names: Mira King, Glenn Pritchard, Forrest Holden. It described how Lenning had built its image around innovation and inclusion while tolerating a rotten culture beneath the marble and glass. Calls for accountability flooded social media. Advocacy groups picked up the story and turned it into a case study. Clients began switching institutions en masse. A trending post on finance Twitter read, "If your bank can't tell a billionaire from a beggar, maybe they shouldn't hold your retirement." By 11 p.m. that night, Lenning's board of directors voted in emergency session to suspend CEO Forrest Holden pending investigation. Along with him, 3 executive vice presidents, compliance, public relations, and regional strategy, were placed on indefinite leave. One had allegedly authorized the original account, flagging that led to Atwell's ejection. Another had failed to report the compliance override from the Harrison account when it came through. The third had knowingly buried an internal bias complaint made 2 years earlier by an employee who said that some clients are treated like liabilities based on their skin tone. The next morning, headlines screamed louder than the boardroom ever had. Class action discussions emerged. Competitor banks posted opportunistic ads promising respect, no matter your profile. Regulators announced a review of lending's tiered access system. A senior member of the House Financial Services Committee issued a statement saying, "When institutions act as gatekeepers of capital, they carry the moral weight of that access." This failure reflects more than negligence. It reflects ideology. Inside corporate offices across the country, HR departments began quietly circulating cautionary memos, noting that anyone associated with the lending fallout should undergo additional ethical screening before being considered for employment. Background checks were expanded to include media analysis, social impact tracking, and internal referral verification. The digital breadcrumbs left behind by staff at Lenning, screenshots, comments, internal messages, performance reviews, formed a mosaic of behavior that now followed them like shadows impossible to shake. Recruiters began pulling resumes that listed Lenning Federal Bank without explanation. In private, financial firms began to refer to the bank not just as a failed institution, but as a case study in ethical collapse. Ethan Mallory, the young assistant who had joked about Atwell's hands looking like those of a pipe worker, applied for a new role at a mid-tier investment house 2 weeks after the story broke. His technical credentials were solid, his GPA flawless, his references scripted and strategic. But when the hiring team ran a routine compliance audit, his name triggered a match against a database of publicly documented corporate controversies. A flagged HR memo from Lenning described his participation in inappropriate commentary during a high-risk client interaction. The quote was direct. The phrasing matched. He was never called back. His follow-ups were ignored. When he tried to apply at other firms, the result was the same. He was unofficially blacklisted, not for incompetence, but for arrogance exercised in the wrong moment, under the illusion of power. Mira Keene, who had overseen client intake and had been directly involved in dismissing Atwell's documents multiple times, found herself in a different type of spiral. After her quiet resignation, a civil rights nonprofit unearthed an anonymous internal complaint that had been submitted by a former employee 3 years earlier, alleging that Mira had engaged in a pattern of coded behavior toward clients of color. The complaint had been closed without action at the time. But now, with national attention focused on Lenning's internal practices, the organization filed a formal legal complaint with the State Financial Ethics Commission. The investigation uncovered 3 prior incidents where Mira had overridden client approvals based on non-conforming appearance or suspicious behavior, despite those clients having full documentation and verified account status. A former auditor from the bank stepped forward as a whistleblower and confirmed that Mira had internally justified these decisions using a phrase he remembered vividly. Just because it's legal doesn't mean it belongs here. When brought before the ethics board, Mira offered a strained apology, blaming burnout, miscommunication, and institutional pressures. But the board was unmoved. They voted unanimously to revoke her certification. She lost her license to operate in the financial advisory field, effective immediately. News of her disbarment spread across professional networks within hours. Her LinkedIn profile was flooded with comments, some sympathetic, others scathing. A trending post read, "The difference between leadership and gatekeeping is the difference between service and sabotage." Mira chose the latter. Meanwhile, Glenn Pritchard, the veteran security guard who had twice confronted Atwell with smug dismissal, attempted to quietly return to his former role at a private security firm in the suburbs. But when his name surfaced during the background check, it triggered an immediate escalation to the firm's compliance officer. The firm's CEO had previously signed a public pledge supporting diversity and inclusion following another high-profile corporate scandal, and Glenn's presence now posed a reputational threat. He was informed via email that his reapplication had been denied. The rejection was polite but firm. The subtext was clear. The world had changed, and he hadn't. Other minor players from Lenning began to feel the consequences in quieter ways. A project manager lost a consulting contract when her new client's advisory board recognized her name from the footnotes of the internal audit. A former executive assistant was dropped from a nonprofit finance committee because their donors had read the viral report and demanded better vetting. The damage was not centralized. It was systemic, slow-burning, and irreparable. Every person who had laughed, delayed, misjudged, or remained silent now found themselves navigating a world in which silence was no longer protection. Atwill, for his part, remained mostly out of view. He gave no more press conferences, made no public statements, and did not engage in debate. But his absence was powerful. His silence felt earned, sovereign. He did not need to witness the downfall. He had already walked through it. It was those who had wielded power so carelessly who now had to live inside the ruins of what they had built. The scandal began appearing in ethics training seminars at universities. Financial compliance courses referenced the case as the Monroe precedent. Bank directors forwarded internal bulletins urging staff to remember that every client has a story you don't know. Treat them like it matters. The city had long moved on to new scandals, new market shifts, and louder controversies by the time Atwill Monroe reappeared, not in headlines or press conferences, but in the quiet corridors of purpose. The media had turned its lens elsewhere, and yet the echo of his actions still lingered in conversations, lectures, and corporate training rooms across the country. Lenning Federal had been absorbed by a larger institution within 6 months, its brand dissolved, its upper leadership erased from public trust, its buildings sold off or repurposed. But in a modest district near the edge of the city, far from the skyscrapers and marble floors, the old branch location had been transformed into something else entirely. A community economic center funded by the Harrison Reconstruction Fund, redesigned to serve minority entrepreneurs, job seekers, and displaced workers with dignity and clarity. Among its new staff was a young woman named Elena Marston, once an administrative aide who had joined in the mockery of Atwill near the coffee machine, whose laughter had been captured on internal recordings during the investigation. After being laid off with most of the mid-tier employees at Lenning, she had struggled to find work in her field. Her credentials remained valid, but her association with the scandal had made callbacks rare. One morning, while scrolling a nonprofit job board in quiet resignation, she came across a listing: Community Program Liaison Harrison Fund. Preference given to applicants with first-hand experience in financial bias culture. She applied not out of strategy, but out of guilt, a guilt that had grown sharper with each passing month as she reread the articles, watched the interview clips, and saw herself in background footage with a smile she no longer recognized. When she was hired part-time, she expected distance and professionalism. She did not expect kindness. But it came not from Atwill directly, who was rarely on site, but from the culture his leadership had shaped. Her first week, she was given access to mentorship logs, including anonymous testimonies from people who had faced systemic disrespect inside major institutions. One of them mirrored Atwill's own experience almost exactly. She began writing personal reflections during her breaks, at first just for herself, but eventually shared them with her supervisor, who encouraged her to keep going. Within 6 months, she was asked to present her story at a panel on inclusive infrastructure, not as a survivor, but as someone who had stood on the other side and changed. Her presentation ended with the line, "Sometimes privilege is not about what you hold, but about what you're allowed to ignore." Meanwhile, in a university auditorium filled with graduate students studying ethical finance, a special guest seminar was being held. Atwill Monroe was invited as the keynote, though he kept his remarks brief and instead opened the floor to questions. In the back row, a woman sat quietly with her hands folded over a notebook. Her name was Mira King. After losing her license and exiting the corporate world, she had spent over a year in voluntary silence, attending workshops, shadowing mediators, studying not just the policies she once abused, but the frameworks of the people she had excluded. She never expected to see Atwill again, But the seminar had been recommended by a colleague at a reconciliation nonprofit, and something in her pushed her to attend. At the end of the event, while students clustered around Atwill with questions and gratitude, she stood back until the crowd thinned. Then she approached slowly, unsure if he would recognize her or even acknowledge her presence. He did both. She introduced herself with a voice barely above a whisper. She apologized, not for the sake of performance, but because she could not breathe right until she did. She told him she didn't expect forgiveness. He listened without interrupting. Then, without a trace of condescension, he asked if she still had the resume she had once sent him 10 years ago, back when she had been fresh out of graduate school and had cold emailed his firm in hopes of a mentorship. Her face collapsed. She said yes, she remembered that email. She said she had assumed he'd never read it. He told her he had saved it. And then, with a steadiness that stunned her, he offered her a role, not in finance, but as a training associate in the Harrison Justice Restoration Program, where her first-hand understanding of policy misuse could be transformed into tools for prevention. Her eyes filled. She said yes, not because she had earned it, but because he had given her the chance to try. By the time the next fiscal year began, dozens of former Lenning employees, not executives, but staffers, interns, branch officers, had voluntarily joined various Harrison Fund community projects across the country. Not all were offered public redemption. Not all wanted it. But those who stepped forward found themselves engaged not in guilt, but in purpose. They were trained not only to teach finance, but to unlearn assumption, to confront silence, to replace suspicion with curiosity, and most of all, to recognize when they were standing at the edge of a system and when they needed to step back from it. As for Atwill, he remained a quiet force. He continued to oversee the fund, advise younger leaders, and redirect capital toward spaces designed to empower rather than exclude. He declined interviews. He turned down awards. When asked what he wanted next, his answer was always the same: a world where my story is no longer remarkable. And perhaps that was the true ending. Not a vengeance fulfilled, not a balance sheet corrected, but a culture shifted, where those who had once seen only difference now saw humanity, where those who had judged now listened, and where those who had laughed now labored, not under shame, but with intention. The end. If this story moved you, make sure to like and subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. What part of the story struck you the most? Was there a moment that caught you off guard? Let us know your thoughts in the comments, and tell us where in the world you're watching from. We'd love to hear your perspective.